What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
I never imagined that the day would arrive when my own son, Mark, whom I had raised with every ounce of love and sacrifice I possessed, would stand in the very kitchen I had meticulously planned and financed through decades of grueling labor, and unleash a torrent of words that sliced through my heart like a jagged blade, declaring with unbridled fury, "Don't you dare argue with my wife in her house," as if I were some unwelcome intruder rather than the woman who had poured her life's blood into constructing that sanctuary from the ground up, paying off every mortgage installment through sleepless nights at the factory and endless hours of budgeting that left no room for luxuries or even the occasional indulgence that other families might take for granted. In that moment, surrounded by the familiar scents of the herbs I had planted in the windowsill garden and the faint echo of laughter from family gatherings long past, I felt a profound sense of betrayal wash over me, compelling me to hold my tongue despite the storm raging inside, because responding with anger would only validate their distorted version of reality. So instead, I simply turned away, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood floors I had sanded and sealed myself, and exited through the door that symbolized both my greatest achievement and now my deepest regret, leaving behind the home that had once represented unbreakable family bonds, but had devolved into a battleground of entitlement and disregard. To truly grasp the depth of this unraveling, one must journey back to the roots of how that house on Maple Lane in our quiet Ohio suburb came to be, a modest three-bedroom ranch-style dwelling that Tom and I, as young high school sweethearts thrust into early parenthood with Mark's unexpected arrival, envisioned as our fortress against the uncertainties of life in the turbulent 80s when inflation clawed at every paycheck and dreams of stability seemed perpetually out of reach for working-class folks like us. We scraped together the down payment from my overtime shifts at the auto parts assembly line, where the metallic tang of machinery and the relentless hum of conveyor belts became my nightly companions, while Tom logged thousands of miles on the interstate in his 18-wheeler, missing out on Mark's first steps and birthday milestones, but ensuring that every dollar from his hauls went straight into the savings jar labeled "Our Future Home," a ritual that kept our hopes alive amid the exhaustion and the quiet fears that whispered about what might happen if illness or accident struck. When we finally closed on the property, it felt like a miracle, the wide yard promising barbecues under summer stars and a garage where Tom could tinker with his beloved old Chevy on weekends, restoring it piece by piece as a metaphor for the life we were building together, until the cruel hand of pancreatic cancer claimed him a decade ago, leaving me to shoulder the remaining payments alone through a fog of grief that made even getting out of bed feel like an insurmountable task. Mark, our only child, grew up within those walls as the center of our universe, inheriting Tom's broad shoulders and easy charisma alongside my unyielding determination. And he blossomed into a young man who pursued a degree at the local community college before landing a steady sales position that afforded him a measure of independence, which I encouraged wholeheartedly because seeing him thrive was the balm for my widowed solitude. Then came Lisa, sweeping into our lives 5 years ago like a whirlwind from the brighter lights of Cleveland, a sharp-witted real estate agent whose polished demeanor and quick laugh initially charmed me during their courtship, leading me to believe she would complement Mark's grounded nature and perhaps even draw him closer to family traditions that I held dear. Their wedding was a joyful affair in the backyard of that very house, with white tents and string lights illuminating the evening as relatives toasted to new beginnings, but soon after, subtle shifts began to erode the harmony, as Lisa embarked on unannounced redecorating projects that transformed the cozy, lived-in spaces into sleek, impersonal showcases more suited to a magazine spread than to the sentimental haven I had nurtured, replacing my cherished floral curtains with minimalist drapes and reorganizing the living room in ways that relegated Tom's hand-carved rocking chair, the one he had gifted me on our 10th anniversary, to an obscure corner where it gathered dust like a forgotten relic. These changes, while irritating in their presumption, might have been overlooked as the quirks of a newlywed asserting her place, but the underlying tension escalated during our annual Thanksgiving gatherings, where the extended family converged in a whirlwind of aromas from roasted turkey and pumpkin pie, My sister Ruth arriving with her lively children in tow and contributing her signature cranberry relish that always sparked debates over the best recipes passed down through generations. On that particular holiday a year ago, as we bustled about setting the table with the heirloom china that had survived my grandmother's journey across the Atlantic, Lisa took charge with an air of authority that bordered on command, dictating the placement of dishes and decorations while dismissing my suggestion to shift the fragile pieces to the sideboard to accommodate the children's craft activities, claiming that such arrangements disrupted her carefully curated aesthetic, a term she wielded like a shield against any input from those who had preceded her in that space. Mark, sensing the friction, interjected on her behalf with a protective fervor that surprised me, brushing off my concerns as outdated preferences, yet I swallowed my frustration for the sake of the occasion. Reminding myself that holidays were meant for gratitude rather than grudges, even as I noticed how Lisa's influence seemed to position her as the undisputed matriarch, subtly sidelining the history embedded in every corner of the home. The breaking point materialized this past spring during a celebratory dinner I hosted to mark Mark's recent promotion at work, an event I prepared for with meticulous care, spending the afternoon tending to the tulip beds in the front yard that Tom had so adored for their vibrant bursts of color each season, only to return inside and discover Lisa methodically rearranging the furniture once more, shoving that irreplaceable rocking chair aside as if it held no more significance than an old lamp from a garage sale. When I voiced a mild protest, emphasizing the chair's emotional value tied to memories of Tom reading bedtime stories to Mark, she responded with an eye roll and a curt remark that sentimental attachments couldn't justify hindering modern updates, her tone laced with the implication that my era had passed its welcome. Mark, entering the room just in time to catch the exchange, exploded into defense mode, his face flushing with indignation as he repeated that infamous line about respecting his wife in her house, the words reverberating through the air like a declaration of war, stripping away any illusion of mutual regard and forcing me to confront the painful reality that the son I had sacrificed for viewed my contributions as obsolete footnotes in their narrative. In the quiet aftermath of that confrontation, as I retreated to the small apartment I had rented across town after Tom's death to give Mark and Lisa the space they desired in the family home, a seething resolve began to form within me, transforming the hurt into a calculated plan for reclamation that started subtly with a single phone call to the utility provider, where I methodically transferred the accounts from the joint setup into my sole control, ensuring that the next exorbitant bill for Lisa's lavish smart home additions would land squarely in their laps without my financial intervention, a move that carried the sting of irony given how often I had bailed them out in the past. The satisfaction of this first act of retribution deepened when Mark's irate voicemail arrived that evening, detailing the chaos of a flickering power supply interrupting their dinner party with colleagues. His confusion evident but laced with an undercurrent of entitlement that only reinforced my determination to withhold further explanations. Yet, as I set the phone down and gazed out at the darkening street, another message buzzed through from Lisa herself, its contents cryptic and demanding. "We need to discuss the deed immediately. Evelyn, things are about to change in ways you won't like." A veiled threat that ignited fresh uncertainty and propelled the conflict into uncharted territory, leaving me to ponder what hidden maneuvers they might be plotting next in the shadows of the home I had built with my own hands. That ominous message from Lisa about the deed hung over me like a persistent fog rolling in from Lake Erie on a dreary morning, stirring a whirlwind of apprehension and resolve as I sat in my modest apartment, surrounded by the sparse furnishings that paled in comparison to the warmth of the home I had surrendered to their care, prompting me to reflect deeply on the myriad sacrifices I had made over the years that now seemed utterly unappreciated in the face of their escalating sense of ownership, because if they believed they could rewrite the narrative of that property so brazenly, it was high time I reminded myself, and perhaps them eventually, of the foundational efforts that had made it all possible without seeking applause or reimbursement. In the days following that text, I chose not to engage directly, allowing the silence to amplify their unease while I revisited the mental ledger of my contributions, starting with the harrowing period after Tom's death when the medical bills cascaded in alongside the mortgage statements, forcing me to juggle 3 part-time jobs that left my body aching from dawn until dusk. From stocking shelves at the local grocery during early shifts where the chill of the coolers seeped into my bones, to cleaning offices in the evenings with the scent of industrial cleaners clinging to my clothes, and even weekend stints as a cashier at the hardware store where I dispensed advice on plumbing fixtures drawn from my own hands-on repairs around the house, all of this orchestrated to ensure that Mark could complete his education without the burden of financial woes that had derailed so many of his peers in our blue-collar community. Through those grueling years, I masked the strain with a steadfast facade for Mark's sake, attending his graduations and job interviews with a smile that belied the exhaustion etched into my features, and when he began dating Lisa, I extended the same generosity by co-signing loans for their first apartment and even dipping into my meager savings to help with wedding expenses, viewing it as an investment in his happiness rather than a transaction expecting repayment. Because in my mind, family support flowed one way, from parents to children, without the need for scorekeeping or resentment until circumstances like these exposed the imbalance in stark relief. Lisa's integration into our dynamic initially appeared benign, her enthusiasm for home staging and design adding a fresh perspective during casual visits where she would sketch ideas on napkins over coffee. But gradually those suggestions morphed into unilateral actions that eroded the personal touches I had curated over decades, such as the time she insisted on replacing the kitchen cabinets with sleek shaker-style ones sourced from a trendy catalog, claiming the originals were dated and incompatible with modern living standards. A project that incurred costs she casually charged to a joint account I had set up years earlier for emergencies, leaving me to cover the overdraft fees from my fixed Social Security checks without so much as a thank you or consultation. As their entitlement burgeoned, so did the subtle encroachments on my autonomy within the space, exemplified by the summer barbecue I hosted for the neighborhood where Lisa commandeered the menu. Banishing my traditional potato salad in favor of a quinoa-based alternative she deemed healthier and more sophisticated, much to the bemusement of our longtime friends who had come to expect the familiar flavors that evoked community and continuity rather than fleeting trends, and Mark, ever the peacemaker turned enabler, laughed off my quiet protest by suggesting I adapt to the changes for the sake of progress, his words carrying an undertone that positioned me as the obstacle rather than the enduring pillar of their stability. This pattern intensified around holidays, particularly Christmas, when the living room that once twinkled with handmade ornaments from Mark's childhood, each one a testament to craft nights spent gluing popsicle sticks and glitter amid the scent of pine from our live tree, became a showcase for Lisa's collection of designer baubles purchased online, the shift not only diminishing the sentimental value but also inflating the holiday budget to levels that strained the household finances, prompting me to contribute anonymously through cash gifts slipped into stockings to prevent arguments over extravagance. The culmination of this mounting disregard unfolded during a routine family dinner in early fall, when I arrived unannounced with a batch of my homemade lasagna, a dish Tom had adored and that Mark had always requested for his birthdays, only to find Lisa in the midst of yet another overhaul, this time stripping the dining area of the oak table set I had inherited from my parents and replaced it with a glass-topped monstrosity that reflected every smudge and spill like a judgmental mirror. Her explanation centering on how the old wood absorbed odors and clashed with her vision of an open-concept flow. When I expressed concern over the hasty disposal of the heirlooms without discussion, citing their irreplaceable nature tied to generations of shared meals and stories, Lisa dismissed it with a wave and a quip about decluttering for mental clarity. But Mark's intervention escalated the exchange into a heated debate where he accused me of meddling in their lifestyle choices, his voice rising in defense of her autonomy until the air thickened with unspoken accusations, forcing me to leave abruptly with the uneaten dish cooling in my arms, the sting of rejection compounding the physical chill of the evening air. Fueled by this latest affront, I orchestrated a measured response that evening under the cover of twilight, slipping back into the house with the spare key I still possessed from years of methodically gathering the displaced treasures that held the essence of our history, the the rocking chair now banished to the garage, Tom's worn leather Bible annotated with passages he had underlined during his final days, and a collection of framed photographs capturing Mark's milestones from Scraped Knees to cap and gown triumphs, boxing them securely and transporting them to my apartment where they could reside in dignity away from further desecration, an act of reclamation disguised as prudence that carried a humorous edge in its stealth. Reminiscent of those old spy movies Mark and I used to watch where the underdog outmaneuvers the oblivious foes without fanfare. Mark discovered the absence the following morning, his confused call interrupting my breakfast as he demanded explanations for the vanishing items, to which I replied calmly that they were merely being preserved from updates that valued style over substance, eliciting a frustrated sigh from him that hinted at cracks in his unwavering support for Lisa's whims. However, as the conversation trailed off with his assurances of sorting it out soon, my attention was drawn to an overlooked stack of mail on my counter from a recent forwarding request, revealing a cascade of credit card statements in Lisa's name alone, emblazoned with charges from luxury boutiques and spa retreats totaling thousands that far exceeded any reasonable splurge, a discovery that unveiled a layer of financial recklessness lurking beneath their polished exterior and ignited a fresh wave of uncertainty about the true extent of their dependencies on the very foundations I had laid, compelling me to question how deep this web of extravagance extended before it ensnared everything I had built. The revelation from those credit card statements propelled me into a state of heightened vigilance that transformed my quiet evenings in the apartment into sessions of meticulous review under the warm glow of a single desk lamp, sifting through the forwarded documents that painted a picture of fiscal irresponsibility far more dire than I had anticipated. With Lisa's expenditures on designer handbags and weekend getaways accumulating like storm clouds over the stable horizon I had worked tirelessly to maintain for the family, compelling me to confront the uncomfortable truth that my unwavering support might have inadvertently enabled a lifestyle that teetered on the brink of collapse without any apparent strategy for sustainability or accountability. As the implications sank in, I recalled the creditor's call from days prior, the anonymous voice inquiring about overdue balances on loans I had never endorsed, and it became evident that Mark's promotion, touted as a beacon of security, masked deeper troubles where optimism clashed with reality in ways that echoed the economic pitfalls many in our age group had navigated during recessions, prompting me to devise a more assertive measure of protection that would safeguard not only the property, but also the fragile remnants of trust between us, because allowing their overspending to erode the equity I had accrued through decades of frugality would be tantamount to betraying the legacy Tom and I had forged against all odds. With that resolve firming like concrete setting in the foundation of the house itself, I reached out the following morning to Hank, the locksmith whose reliable hands had fixed countless door mechanisms around the neighborhood since his days apprenticing under my late father-in-law, scheduling a discreet visit to Maple Lane during the midday lull when Mark would be immersed in client meetings at his office and Lisa occupied with showings for prospective buyers in the city, ensuring that the operation unfolded without confrontation or the opportunity for immediate rebuttal that might dilute its impact. Hank arrived promptly in his weathered van emblazoned with the local hardware store's logo, his familiar face creased with understanding as I explained the situation in hushed tones on the porch, and together we entered the home that felt both intimately mine and strangely foreign under the recent alterations, proceeding to replace the front, back, and side door locks with high security models that clicked into place with a satisfying finality, each turn of the key symbolizing a reclamation of boundaries that had been trampled underfoot by assumptions of perpetual access and control. I left the old keys in a plain envelope taped to the interior side of the front door, accompanied by a handwritten note in my careful script that read, "We need an honest conversation about respect and reality before anyone steps foot inside again. Let's resolve this as family, not foes," a gesture intended to underscore the gravity without descending into outright hostility, and as Hank drove away with a nod of solidarity, I felt a surge of empowered clarity, the kind that comes from taking a stand after years of yielding, mingled with a touch of wry amusement at the irony of securing my own creation against those who now claimed it as theirs. Word of the lock change rippled through our close-knit suburb faster than gossip at a Sunday church social, with neighbors who had watched Mark and Lisa's comings and goings for years exchanging speculative glances over backyard fences and during walks with their dogs. And by late afternoon, my phone vibrated incessantly with messages from Ruth, who had learned of it through the grapevine and implored me in her maternal tone to reconsider before the rift became irreparable, emphasizing how family ties in our community were the threads that wove the social fabric together against the isolation of modern life. Mark's initial reaction arrived via a flurry of texts that escalated from bewildered inquiries, "Mom, what's going on? The door won't budge," to accusations of overreaction that bordered on betrayal, his words conveying a frustration rooted in inconvenience rather than introspection, while I maintained radio silence, allowing the barrier to serve as a physical manifestation of the emotional walls that had risen between us, reflecting on how this moment paralleled the quiet dignity with which I had handled Tom's funeral arrangements, prioritizing composure amid chaos to preserve what dignity remained. The plot thickened that evening when Mark finally connected by phone, his voice stripped of its usual confidence and laced with a vulnerability that tugged at the maternal instincts I had suppressed in favor of self-preservation. As he confessed the mounting pressures of debts accrued through Lisa's ambitious real estate side hustles that had faltered amid market fluctuations, admitting that the so-called flips were underwater investments propped up by credit extensions he had hidden from me to avoid burdening the woman who had already sacrificed so much. He pleaded for temporary access to retrieve work documents and personal effects, vowing to address the financial disarray through counseling and budget overhauls, but I held steady, insisting that true resolution required acknowledgement of the house's origins and the undue liberties taken with its stewardship, a stance that, while firm, elicited a momentary hesitation in his responses that hinted at layers of deception yet unexplored, such as the possibility that Lisa's ventures involved more than mere bad luck. Lisa seized the line midway through the call, her tone shifting from indignation to a calculated appeal laced with tears she claimed were genuine, decrying my actions as punitive measures that threatened their stability and invoking the specter of marital discord exacerbated by external interference. Yet her words rang with a performative quality that reminded me of community theater productions where emotions were amplified for effect rather than authenticity, making me wonder if her histrionics masked a deeper agenda tied to the deed discussions she had initiated. Undeterred by the emotional barrage, I implemented the next facet of my strategy later that night, contacting our longtime neighbor Betty, the self-appointed sentinel of neighborhood harmony whose bridge club gatherings disseminated information with the efficiency of a news wire, and casually shared an anecdote about the unpermitted renovations Lisa had undertaken, framing it as a light-hearted cautionary tale about zoning oversights that could lead to unexpected inspections, a disclosure that carried just enough truth from the bills I had reviewed to prompt action without outright malice, and the resulting buzz ensured that by morning, whispers of potential code violations would reach the ears of local authorities through Betty's network, a clever maneuver that promised to impose consequences on their unchecked alterations while allowing me the distance of plausible deniability. Mark's subsequent voicemail captured the mounting panic as he described futile attempts to enter the home. Under the cover of dusk, his knocks echoing unanswered against the reinforced doors, but woven into his desperation was an odd pause, a subtle evasion when pressed about the full scope of their finances, suggesting that his begging concealed motivations beyond mere retrieval, perhaps a desperate bid to secure assets or documents that could alter the balance of power in ways I had yet to fathom. As I replayed the message in the dim light of my living room, another call pierced the quiet from an unfamiliar number, the voice on the other end identifying as a colleague of Mark's who, after some prodding, alluded to rumors of internal audits at his firm related to expense discrepancies, a twist that deepened the shadows of uncertainty and left me grappling with the fear that the conflicts we had ignited might unravel threads far more entangled than the simple matter of locks and ledgers, propelling the narrative toward confrontations that promised revelations both painful and unforeseen. That unexpected call about the audits at Mark's workplace lingered in my thoughts, like an unwelcome guest who overstays their welcome at a family reunion, casting long shadows over the tentative satisfaction I had derived from the lock change and the ripples it sent through their carefully constructed facade, because if professional scrutiny was now joining the personal fray, it suggested a convergence of crises that could either force a reckoning or spiral into irreparable damage, compelling me to balance my protective instincts with the growing temptation to let natural consequences unfold without further intervention from the woman who had already extended far more grace than perhaps deserved. Ruth's persistent messages throughout the day amplified this internal tug-of-war, her appeals laced with the wisdom of someone who had mediated countless sibling squabbles and marital spats in our extended circle, urging me to unlock the doors before pride erected barriers too high for reconciliation, yet her words only deepened the uncertainty as I pondered whether yielding now would reinforce their pattern of disregard or signal a path toward mending the fractures that had widened with each unacknowledged slight. By midday, the pressure mounted when Mark appeared uninvited at my apartment door, his appearance disheveled in a way that evoked memories of his teenage rebellions after Tom's death when grief manifested in unkempt hair and slumped shoulders. But this time the vulnerability carried an edge of calculation as he knelt on the worn doormat, clutching a folder of what he claimed were repayment plans and legal documents outlining a buyout offer for the house, his eyes pleading for access to gather essentials that would supposedly stabilize their faltering world. Lisa hovered behind him on the narrow sidewalk, her usual poise fractured into fidgety gestures that betrayed the strain of sleepless nights and mounting bills, and as neighbors began to emerge from their homes under the guise of retrieving mail or watering plants, the scene devolved into a public spectacle that unfolded with the dramatic flair of those neighborhood dramas whispered about at grocery checkouts, where personal woes become communal lore in tight-knit suburbs like ours where privacy is as much a luxury as the manicured lawns everyone strives to maintain. Mark's entreaties grew more fervent, detailing how the locked home prevented him from accessing client files crucial to salvaging his job amid the audit whispers, while Lisa, unable to contain her escalating distress, collapsed onto the patchy grass of the adjacent lawn in a theatrical display of sobs that echoed down the block, her cries proclaiming tales of impending homelessness and shattered dreams attributed to my unyielding stance, drawing sympathetic murmurs from onlookers who had long viewed her as the vibrant newcomer injecting energy into our routine lives. The absurdity of it all elicited a bitter chuckle within me, reminiscent of those sitcom episodes where over-the-top reactions highlight life's ironies, but the humor faded as a patrol car slowed at the curb. Summoned by a concerned retiree who mistook the commotion for domestic unrest, the officers measured questions, forcing Mark to spin a narrative of familial misunderstanding that painted me as the obstinate holdout rather than the rightful steward. Even as I stood framed in the doorway, arms crossed in a posture of quiet defiance that masked the turmoil of watching my son reduced to begging on what amounted to public display, Ruth arrived in the midst of this orchestrated chaos like a timely mediator dispatched from a higher authority, her sensible sedan pulling up with the crunch of tires on gravel and her no-nonsense stride cutting through the gathering crowd, pulling me aside with a firm grip on my elbow to deliver a stern lecture on the perils of escalating conflicts that could alienate not just Mark, but the broader family network we had relied upon through hardships like job losses and health scares that bound our Ohio community in shared resilience. She recounted anecdotes from her own marriage where compromise had preserved harmony against odds steeper than ours, suggesting that withholding the keys indefinitely might position me as the villain in the eyes of those who valued unity over individual vindication, a perspective that resonated uncomfortably with the societal expectations placed on mothers of my generation to absorb slights for the greater good, prompting a flicker of self-doubt as I observed Lisa's continued wails and Mark's downcast gaze, wondering if my revenges, though cleverly executed, were eroding the maternal legacy I had strived to embody amid the sacrifices that defined my widowhood. Yet, even as Ruth's intervention softened the edges of my resolve, it also illuminated the manipulations at play, with Lisa's performance seeming calibrated to garner external sympathy and pressure me into capitulation. A tactic that echoed the passive-aggressive dynamics I had witnessed in support groups for empty nesters grappling with adult children's ingratitude. Seizing a moment of relative calm as the officer departed with assurances of monitoring the situation, I retreated indoors briefly to retrieve a set of duplicate documents from my safe. Mortgage records and property titles that affirmed my sole ownership, then emerged to hand Mark a sealed envelope containing redacted copies, deliberately omitting the full financial disclosures and amendment clauses that could facilitate their buyout schemes. A witty omission framed as an act of partial generosity that allowed them glimpses of legitimacy while withholding the leverage needed for hasty maneuvers, ensuring that any further steps would require direct negotiation on my terms rather than unilateral assumptions. Mark's grateful clasp of the packet carried an undercurrent of relief mingled with frustration at the incompleteness, his murmured thanks contrasting sharply with Lisa's accusatory glares from her seated position on the grass, where she now rocked slightly as if composing herself for the next act in this unintended neighborhood theater, and as they gathered their wits to depart, Ruth lingered to press a small, worn envelope into my hand, whispering that she had discovered it wedged behind a drawer in the home study during a recent visit under pretense of checking on the plants. Its faded postmark dating back to the era before Mark's birth and addressed in a handwriting unfamiliar, yet hauntingly recognizable as belonging to Tom's estranged brother, a man whose sporadic communications had always carried an air of unresolved tension. The weight of that envelope burned in my palm long after Ruth drove away and the crowd dispersed, its contents promising revelations that could upend the very foundations of our family narrative, stirring a profound uncertainty about whether the betrayals I sought to avenge were mere symptoms of deeper, long-buried fractures originating from choices made in the shadows of my early marriage, leaving me to stare at the sealed flap in the solitude of my kitchen. The distant echoes of Lisa's cries, fading into the evening, but replaced by the ominous whisper of secrets poised to emerge and redefine the conflicts that had driven us to this precipice of confrontation and potential irretrievable loss. The unopened envelope from Ruth weighed upon me through the restless hours of that night like an anchor dragging against the currents of my convictions, its sealed contents harboring the potential to dismantle the very assumptions that had underpinned my life's narrative and the revenges I had meticulously deployed against the encroachments on my home and dignity. Because if the words within confirmed suspicions long suppressed about Tom's fidelity during the turbulent years of our courtship and early marriage, it would recast Mark not just as the beneficiary of my sacrifices, but as a living emblem of uncertainties that could either absolve or condemn the choices I had made in forging our family amid the economic hardships and personal vulnerabilities that defined our working-class existence in the heartland. As dawn filtered through the curtains of my apartment, casting elongated shadows that mirrored the elongated doubts stretching across my resolve, I finally summoned the courage to slit the flap with a kitchen knife whose blade trembled slightly in my grasp, the paper yielding to reveal a letter penned in the looping script of Tom's brother Uncle Ray, a man who had drifted in and out of our lives like a seasonal migrant worker, confessing in measured but remorseful tones to a brief affair with me during a period when Tom was away on extended hauls and loneliness had woven its insidious threads through the fabric of my isolation, the implications hanging starkly that Mark's conception might trace to that indiscretion rather than the man I had mourned as his father, a revelation that blurred the lines of blood and bond in ways that challenged the authenticity of every hug, every provision, and every quiet endurance I had offered without question. This bombshell, unfolding in the solitude of my morning coffee ritual where the steam rose like unspoken regrets, forced a reevaluation of the conflicts that had propelled me to this juncture, intertwining the personal betrayals of the present with echoes of past indiscretions that now seemed to justify, or perhaps complicate, the ruthlessness of my countermeasures. As the possibility that Mark carried genes not of Tom's lineage but of a fleeting mistake rendered my sacrifices both more poignant. and potentially misguided, evoking a profound uncertainty about whether avenging the house's desecration was an act of rightful reclamation or a displacement of deeper familial fractures that had festered unseen for decades. Ruth's earlier warnings resurfaced in my mind with renewed urgency, her counsel against unearthing old wounds resonating now as I folded the letter away in a drawer alongside Tom's watch and the family photos I had rescued, deciding in that moment to withhold this truth from Mark lest it shatter him amid his current tempests, yet the knowledge empowered a final, calculated escalation in our standoff, one that would culminate the series of witty retorts I had initiated with the utility switch and the heirloom retrieval, transforming passive resistance into an unequivocal assertion of boundaries that left no room for further negotiation without genuine atonement. Throughout the day, Mark's communications intensified via texts that blended desperation with defiance, outlining frantic efforts to secure temporary housing through colleagues and hinting at legal consultations that could challenge my ownership claims, while Lisa's indirect barbs filtered through social media posts decrying ungrateful elders in veiled allusions that stirred the neighborhood's collective judgment, positioning their plight as a modern morality tale of generational clash where the younger couple emerged as sympathetic underdogs against an unyielding matriarch. By late afternoon, the inevitable confrontation materialized at the house itself, where Mark and Lisa, armed with a locksmith of their own and a court order application in hand, attempted to breach the barriers I had imposed, only to find the reinforced doors unyielding and the windows secured with the same determination that had seen me through factory layoffs and widowhood's isolation, their frustrated pounding drawing a small assembly of curious residents who gathered at a respectful distance, murmuring speculations that blended sympathy for the displaced pair with recollections of my long-standing generosity toward them over the years. Lisa's breakdown commenced in earnest on the front lawn, her body crumpling amid the trampled tulips I had planted in memory of Tom, her wails piercing the crisp air with declarations of ruin and abandonment that evoked the dramatic finales of those soap operas she favored, while Mark, dropping to his knees beside her, rummaged through a duffel bag for personal items salvaged from their car, begging aloud for the return of laptops, clothing, and sentimental trinkets that symbolized the life they had built or borrowed within those walls. His voice cracking with a rawness that pierced my armor as I observed from the vantage of a parked car down the street, the scene unfolding like the poignant climax of a family saga where retribution meets remorse in unequal measures. The gathering crowd amplified the spectacle, with Betty offering tissues and platitudes to Lisa while casting sidelong glances my way that conveyed a mix of disapproval and reluctant understanding, their presence underscoring how my actions, though born of justified grievance, now invited communal censure that made me question the cost of satisfaction derived from witnessing their vulnerability on the very turf I had nurtured through seasons of toil and tenderness. In a move that blended finality with a touch of merciful pragmatism, I drove forward slowly and deposited several sealed boxes on the porch from the anonymity of the vehicle, each containing essentials like changes of clothes, work devices, and select keepsakes I had held in safekeeping, accompanied by a terse note that read, "These are yours to start anew, but the house remains a testament to what was earned, not assumed. Reflect before you rebuild." A parting shot witty in its conditional grace that provided relief without surrender, allowing them to scramble for the provisions amid Lisa's escalating cries and the dispersing onlookers who shook their heads at the unfolding drama. The distant wail of an approaching siren suggesting either a welfare check or mere coincidence that heightened the tension without resolution. Mark's eyes locked onto mine through the car window in that instant, a flash of betrayal mingling with unspoken questions that hinted at the deeper secrets I now guarded, and as I accelerated away, the ambiguity settled over the episode like dusk over Maple Lane, leaving unresolved the fate of our bonds. Would this eviction forge a path to humility and reconciliation, or had my revenges, culminating in this orchestrated humiliation, severed ties irreparably, prompting reflections on whether the pursuit of justice in the face of ingratitude justifies the isolation it inevitably breeds, and what truths, like the letter's confession, might yet surface too. Redefine forgiveness in the quiet aftermath of such stormy reckonings.